I think I know most everybody here, or I've seen you around on campus, so thank you for coming in and allowing me to share with you my little journey. As she was saying, I came to my career late in life. I didn't start out thinking I wanted to be a librarian. Actually, few people do. You discover that when you go to school to become a librarian. Very few people think they want to do that. They come to it through other avenues. For me, I was looking for something more fulfilling, and people kept saying to me, you research a lot. And this was before internet. And then when internet came, I really went crazy. And people, family and friends, would come to me and ask me to research things. Finally, in one of my classes when I went back to school, someone said, would you like to shadow me on the job? And I never got around to doing that, but I did decide to get a part-time job in a library and see if I liked it. And within a week, I was enrolled in graduate school to go on. So I kind of found my vocation late in life, but brings me much satisfaction. And one of those things is I read for pleasure, yes, but I read constantly for work, because as a reference librarian, I literally never ever know when a topic is going to come in useful in answering a question. It just happened yesterday. A young man asking about Richard III, and I used to belong to the Richard III Society for about a decade, and I said, why, yes, I know a thing or two about that, and off we went. So every time I read, I often go off on these little forays, or benders as I call them. My family is very indulgent with that. And my girlfriend Judy, sometimes I kind of disappear for a month or two, or she'll say, let's go do this, let's go do that, and I go, well, I'm committed to this. So I research a lot on my own. Nobody holds a gun to my head, but it's pleasure for me. So I joined a book club a little over a year ago, and I'd never done that before. You'd think I would, love reading, libraries and all of that. But I was resistant because I have so many lists of books and piles of books on my own, let alone someone suggesting others. But I've discovered it's forcing me into reading that I really didn't anticipate. And I'm trying not to be a book snob. I'm a non-reference person at heart. But I love historical fiction. I love biographies, autobiographies. So when it came my turn to choose a book, I had seen about this, here's Exhibit A, Sue Monk Kidd, The Invention of Wings. Now at the time I saw it, it didn't have the Oprah badge of approval yet, because as a professional librarian, we get professional journals and we're always reading reviews and pre-pub, they call it, about books. So I saw a full-page ad for this book, and it intrigued me. So I thought, oh, that looks like one we should buy at the library. And so I did, and I read it as soon as it came out, and then of course it got the Oprah endorsement, and the rippled Oprah effect took place, and so it's a bestseller now. So I highly recommend you read it. Good luck, get on a reading list now because it is in high demand. I'm already picturing who's going to play what parts in a movie, because you heard it here first. It's going to be a movie, I know it will. So I read the book, I read it again, and when Kathy, when I saw the theme and I saw her coming, literally, she told it correctly. I said yes before she asked the question because I knew I wanted to share this, because I did go on one of my research benders, and I did not know about the Grimké sisters, and it's based in particular on Sarah the Elder. So I just wanted to share with you, this is called a speaker series now. I'm used to it being a lunch and learn, which I see as casual. So I just want to share with you, I'm by no means an expert on the topic of the abolition movement, the 19th century, the very beginning of women's movement. But this is how I learn. I start to know more about those things, and so I'll immerse myself in a period for a little while and absorb a lot and move on. So for now, I'm kind of immersed in the 19th century, but instead of England with my beloved Jane Austen, as I usually am, I'm now in the United States, in the antebellum South. So for Women's History Month, I had created a website. I hope you've all taken a little opportunity to look at it. You can get to it from the homepage of the library. The presidential proclamation, press release, so on and so forth, a little history. Here's our theme for the month. And I couldn't resist putting Tammy Duckworth, because she's one of the honorees. Every year they pick some honorees to exhibit the theme, and I just love Tammy Duckworth, so I put her on there. I keep hoping someone in her office will notice and call me, but they haven't yet. This is my link to the guide I've developed for this. And this is very much a work in progress. So if you see a typo, tell me afterwards. You may see a couple blank spots where I literally just ran out of time. I was working on this until about 45 minutes ago because I just keep finding things, and there's a lot more I want to do. So my hope is to grow both the women's history page, and from time to time I want to highlight a book and add it to here. I've done another that I'll add on. How many of you read the Devil in the White City? We did the one book, one kind. Okay. I developed project for that for a summer school class I took last year, and I'm going to connect it as well. So when I go into these books and go crazy with research, I'm going to make something out of it, and you have to look at it. So this is the Grimké sisters, Sarah and Angelina. A little bit of introduction is in order. Some reviews, if you can take my word for it, but I read the reviews, and that's what got me to go for the book. The Grimké sisters are 2 of 14 children, 11 of which survived. I did not know of them. Does anybody here ever heard of them? Can someone get the door for my friend Gerda? There we go. She may need a little assistance. Okay, Gerda's here. So this is the Grimké sisters. Where was I? Oh, has anyone heard of them before? You have. Of course you would. You know everything, Steve. Easy. I was actually hoping he would be here and Rob Alari because they know the history and religion like crazy. I'm surprised, actually, I hope he comes back because he may be able to fill us in on some of the historical context. The Grimké sisters, actually Sarah on the left is the elder by 12 years. Angelina is the younger one. Sarah is one of the main characters in the book. The book focuses on several characters, but primarily on 2. And the chapters flip back and forth. So it's almost like an epistolary story, but instead of letters, you have your chapter. So one chapter will be named Sarah, and the other will be named for her serving girl, her slave, Hetty Handful. So it goes back and forth the 2, hence my table representing the 2. Over here, we have Hetty, the household slave. Handful is her basket name. These props are to remind me of things I need to say. Her basket name, the slaves when they were born were named by, if they were born on the plantation, often named by their master. They took the master's last name, so the slave was Handful Grimké. Her mother gave her a basket name, and I guess this was common in among African American slaves, because it was meaningful to her and meaningful to the child. Yes, the master named you, but we're going to give you our own name. And it was usually very instantaneous without a lot of thought. Could be a season, could be a star, something in nature. Handful was named Handful because her mother said she came early and she was no more than a handful. She was a little tiny baby. They weren't sure she'd make it. So we have Handful, the slave, on this side. On this side, we have Sarah. Sarah and Angelina as 2 of 14 children born in one of the preeminent families in South Carolina. Both of them come from backgrounds that are quite famous and influential. Sarah's mother, Mary Smith Grimké, was a cousin of Abigail Smith Adams, i.e. John Adams, the First Lady. Okay, so she's related to her. The Grimkes, John Fauchereau Grimké, their father, had gone to school in England, very privileged background. His family was one of about 8 or 10 that were sent over to colonize South Carolina by Charles II, I think. So he comes from a long background. Among families in South Carolina, and if you've read any books about South Carolina, my book club has done a couple, they have a very distinctive and strong hierarchy among their social structure. Very much almost derived from class system and the aristocracy in England. It wasn't enough to have money or to become wealthy from your plantation. And by the way, you know, they were gentlemen, so nobody was out there doing it themselves, hence the slaves, lots of slaves. But it wasn't enough to just have wealth. They also had status and reputation. And in South Carolina, if you weren't one of those 10, 12 families, I've enlarged it a little, then you were nobody. So very important to marry off your daughters to the right other family in the social circle. So you kept the plantations. We've seen this time and again with different cultures, different countries with landed gentry. They want to keep it all to themselves, so you marry somebody appropriate class, and then you merge. It's a merger. So there were high expectations for girls. 11 of the children of 14 survived, and Sarah was number 6, and Angelina was either 13 or 14. I think she was the baby. I think she was the last one. Surprise. 12 years difference, but I'll get into that in a little bit. This, on the left, Gerda Lerner, is featured in a women's history poster of a year or so ago. I didn't realize when I took it, it's somebody who has their branding all over it. Might be illegal, but I don't think they're going to come after me for today's presentation. But there she is. She just died in 2013, so I'm thinking this was last year's poster. She is the preeminent biographer of the Grimkes in contemporary times. So she did an update of what was known of this lady, Catherine Burney. And one of my coworkers who isn't here, Mary Jean, was very kind to do some interlibrary loans for me, because when I get on these research benders, I find the things, and usually I end up finding a couple books that we don't have, so I have to borrow them from somebody. And this one was hard to read, the Burney book, because she's a contemporary, not quite in the same time period. I think this was 1885. But when you read it, it's not exactly an easy read. There's some of the syntax and things going on. But she also doesn't pay a great deal of attention to whether she's directly quoting or she's alluding to something she heard secondhand. But she gives a lot of firsthand, I'm using the term loosely, information about Sarah and Angelina Grimké. And she'll say, she'll tell stories about their interactions with slave and their mother and whatnot. So you can never be sure. We've always assumed this is factual, but it's not really cited and quoted the way we do biographical research now. So that in itself was a foray, kind of finding out how research differs. You have to be cautious with that. This one, the Lerner book, sort of picks up and expands on that with more scholarship. And students will say, you know, why do they keep writing about so-and-so and so-and-so? And I tell them, because as time goes on, not only do we look at things through a different lens, but we also often find more information, like this Richard III topic I was helping a student with yesterday. We know more than we did 5 years ago, since they unearthed, presumably, his bones in England last year. So you keep finding out more information. Since the time of the second biographer, there have been some archival materials that were donated to a university in South Carolina, because they're finally coming to appreciate these women. I have to watch my time too, because I'm used to speaking 80 minutes. I don't get that long with you. So that's sort of the Grimkes and their background. Let's see, there was something else I wanted to share with you. The Grimké sisters, Sarah was, well, the pictures sort of speak for themselves, and we're used to seeing pictures like this where they're rather severe, but that's the way photography was. Then this is about the only picture I've ever seen of her. Angelina also, I saw one other. But if you were only going to have one portrait painted, one picture taken, one etching done of you in your lifetime, you wanted it to be serious, I guess. So they generally looked real serious. Sarah was once told, and she was an experimenter. She was, both were as genteel ladies of their time in the South, and as exemplars of the cult of womanhood, as it were. To be a proper woman, to find the right husband, to live your life as you should, You needed to have faith. You needed to have some dignity and gravitas. You needed to come from the right family in their instance. So they had those things going for them. However, the one thing that was not valued as much that they were overflowing with in abundance was intellect, inquisitiveness, intelligence, and they asked a lot of questions. So they were smart girls aching to do something with their brains. Very early on, Sarah would sneak into her father's library. He was not only, I forget the name, begins with I. It's equivalent to mayor of Charleston, but they called it something else. Her father had been a Supreme Court justice for the state of South Carolina. He helped write a lot of the original legislation, the slave codes, things of that nature. So he was very influential in state politics. He was in the Revolutionary War with George Washington, so he was up there with all the heavies, corresponded with Madison. So her family came from political military background, and as a jurist, sent his sons on to become likewise. Well, she wanted a piece of that, so she would steal in the library and he would sort of turn a blind eye. Sarah was actually her father's favorite. I think well, this is where fiction and nonfiction, but I can't find evidence of it in the nonfiction, but in the fiction version, she's her father's favorite, and he dotes on her. He feels a little sorry for her out of all the children. She's a little awkward, but she has this great intellect. So at the dinner table, she would sit there and debate issues of the day, including the institution of slavery. Later on, it becomes a little bit of women's votes. But she banters with him on an equal basis. And on his deathbed, he finally does confess. And I did find this both, this is in the book and in the historical documents. He did say words to her of the effect that, had you been a son, you would have gone on to do great things, probably follow my footsteps. Almost broke her heart because she went on to do other things, but that's really what she wanted to do. So she had to hide her brain. She would steal books and read them, put them back, until the time it was found out around her 11th birthday when they had their society tea party. Oops, another prop. I brought props. The ladies of South Carolina were genteel, so they would have their gloves on and their tea. They would have a fan because it was very hot. If they needed a salt or pepper at their party, your slave would tell the slave over there to pass the salt. That slave would give it to him. They'd put him here. So they were raised with incredible ease. They never did anything for themselves. And she was always a little uncomfortable with that. On her 11th birthday, she did receive as her gift her own personal slave. And that's what everyone had one. Everyone in the family, all 11, 12 of them, had their own personal slave, in addition to the household slaves, the cooking slaves, all of those other slaves that run a huge house. And they were actually, the slaves in this house were probably living a little better than the ones on plantation, but believe me, you get lots of this in the story. It did not always go so well for them. Well, she received Hetty Handful as her slave. Hetty was very small for her size. I told you she was no more than a handful, premature. And Hetty was very, raw, shall we say, breaking teacups, practically burning down the house, stoking fires. And she tried to refuse her at the society party with all the ladies and the teacups and everything. It did not go down well. Big embarrassment to the family. Adamantly refused. She did not want a slave sleeping on the floor outside of her bedroom at night, because now she was out of the nursery and into her own room. And that's what they did. The slaves slept on the floor right outside their room, emptied their chamber pots, brushed their hair, dressed them, everything. She was trying to refuse that. At an early age, both girls had witnessed some horrendous treatment of slaves, and it scarred them. I think Sarah was about 4 or 5, actually ran away from home, stood on the docks, begging the nearest sailor she saw to take her away. She didn't want to live where they had slaves. And Angelina had a similar experience. So both of them had a really deep-seated hatred for the things that they were seeing among their own slaves in the household. And their mother was quite severe with their slaves. Many stories in the book. Some of them I can find corroborated in the literature, so there's not much made up in this book, so when you read it, you can keep that in mind. The character of Hetty Handful, there's a little bit more creativity because they didn't document slaves' lives. The slaves didn't keep diaries. Nobody was walking around, well, how do you feel? Well, what's your day like? It just didn't happen. So later on, when there was a little bit of literacy, you would start to get those records. In fact, their father is one of the people who was instigator behind some of the slave laws, including you don't teach your slaves to read. If you're going to keep them down, don't let them read. And their thought was, but you make them go to church. They have to stand around in the morning after breakfast and listen to our sermons and prayers. So everything was prayerful and religious, but why are we treating these people, God's creatures, this way? So very early on, they were questioning that dichotomy. They did not understand how you can be a good Christian and so on, and still feel that way. So she refuses her slave. She takes the papers that they had official documentation giving her this slave, and she tears them up and leaves them in her father's study. Later on, she finds the papers outside her room and gets in deep trouble for it. So thereafter, she says to herself and to Hetty Handful, I tried to give you away, I can't, so we'll make the best of it. So she gave her a little bit of an easier time, and at night when they were supposed to be, Handful was supposed to be getting her to bed, she was actually teaching her to read a little bit. And this was against South Carolina law. When she's caught at it, her father just goes crazy on her. The accounts of that differ a little bit in the fiction from the nonfiction, but it's still pretty severe because it broke her heart. She had been his favorite, and now she was forbidden from the library, forbidden from reading, and told, we will not break the laws of South Carolina, of which I am one of the chief administrators. Even though in his debates at the dinner table and his own personal reflections to family, it seemed like he was himself questioning a little bit exactly what were they doing as Christians. So this leads me to a little bit of a discovery I found, that the original, I'm going to skip over to here, the original context, if you will, in the title of my presentation, I talk about the split between the anti-slavery, the abolitionist movement, and the suffrage feminist movement. Well, they didn't call it feminist then, women's movement, women's rights. And that really came about from, the whole thing started with the church, with religion. You primarily had Episcopalians, Presbyterians that they grew up with. But on a venture north with her father for medical care in Philadelphia as a young woman, she was exposed to Quakers, the Society of Friends. And that's where she found out, well, there's a lot of people up here that think this is no good. And she was exposed to abolitionist literature and their ideals. And she was attracted to that. And in fact, one of who was kind of acting as her religious advisor said to her, you would make a very good Quaker with your plain face and all. I'm paraphrasing, but that's basically, later on he proposed to her when his wife died and he had a bunch of children and he thought plain Sarah could be an excellent wife. She refused him twice, to her credit, because she found her vocation in gaining her voice. So the whole movement, the anti-slavery movement, was very much grounded in the churches up north. And Later on, when Sarah and Angelina start to find their voices a little bit, and they realize they may be the spinster sisters, they're not going anywhere, doing anything, they have a voice. They discover that, well, wait a minute, these things we're saying that man is doing to the slaves, these rights, these human rights, and Sarah was one of the first people actually talking about human rights, these human rights that we're denying them, half of that's denied to women too. And we could have a much stronger voice in this whole anti-slave movement if we as women had a little bit of respectability too. So they didn't start out thinking that way, but it was becoming apparent because the whole crux of their controversy, and they were very controversial in their time, was that they were starting out to speak against this. They were actually asked to speak because as two extremely privileged, wealthy young women from the South who owned lots and lots of slaves, grew up with them, deep culture of slavery, they could tell you a thing or two, not just reading pamphlets and broadsides and hearing other stories. They were going to hear it from the source. So people were very intrigued to hear these women. They started out being invited to speak to women's groups. They would go to living rooms, parlors. They would go to churches and speak. Eventually, they were getting so popular, they had to keep finding bigger and bigger venues. And this is what leads to some trouble later on. First of all, I want to backtrack here. There are lots of historical characters in the book, and that took me on yet another bend in the road in research. And some of these you'll know, some of them I'd heard of, but I didn't really realize how intertwined all these people were. They were all sort of in the same circles. One of the most colorful characters, I'll do him first because I'll be surprised if anyone has ever heard of Denmark Vesey. Does it ring a bell? Ding, ding. Alex Trebek. I'll take free black men of the 19th century for 300. Denmark Vesey, it's an exotic name. He was named by a captain. He came from the Caribbean. He was a slave as a young man. He also was marked for his intelligence, and he had a certain bearing about him that marked him as somebody special, the kind you'd want as a personal slave. So Denmark Vesey became a favorite and traveled all over, hence the name Denmark. Vesey was the captain's name, again, takes the owner's last name. So he'd been to Europe, England, all over the place. When he settled down in Charleston, he actually had managed to save up enough money and earn enough money to buy his own freedom. But he did better than that. He took some of that money and bought a lottery ticket. And then he hit the jackpot, got enough money to buy a house, buy a carpentry business, set himself up, had many wives all over town, several children. Quite the character, but a real firebrand. Spoke very well, recited biblical verses like crazy. He also was a very magnetic personality, drawing people to see him. He plays a very interesting role in the book. Hetty Handful's mother, Charlotte, who's a slave that's been with the Grimkes for quite a while, actually becomes his lover. I won't give away much more than that because I truly am hoping some of you will read this. And now it feels like 5th grade where I tell you a few things and then I say, but you'll have to read it yourself. But I hope you do. He's a very fiery character. Look him up, Google, skip the Wikipedia stuff and go to some of the better sources. My site here is loaded with some links. There is such a thing called the Vesey Uprising. He nearly succeeded in organizing a mass operation of slaves, weapons, but more than anything, changing attitudes of the slaves. Like, you know what? We outnumber the white people in Charleston 2-1. We can do this. And he, but again, it was sort of founded on religion. He would talk in the churches. For a while, the slaves had their own church till it was discovered they were getting political. So Denmark Vesey is a very colorful character in there. And historically, from what I found in the book and looked up elsewhere, there's his house, which is a National Historic Landmark. In fact, many of the sites and places affiliated with these people are part of some historic landmarks. There's a PBS series on them, The Vesey Conspiracy. Read about it. It's pretty interesting. It was put down. A couple slaves thought they might get in trouble, and they told their masters, so the whole thing fell apart. But it did instill a lot of fear in the plantation owners and slave owners in general, so it sort of changed things. Here's some more of the Grimké family, and this is probably the most fascinating thing I learned about everything on my little research foray. The Grimkes were everywhere. Grimkes, Fortons, you'll see some of these names when you go on research. they're nearly all famous or became something. They're really quite a remarkable family. I told you about John Fauchereau. He was French Huguenot. So when they came to this country, they were early settlers. And both of them came from aristocratic backgrounds. This one, Thomas Smith, is Sarah's favorite brother. In the book, he plays a pivotal role in her intellectual life. He would teach her a little Greek and Latin, the subjects that only the boys were allowed to study. No expense was spared for their education, but girls didn't need to know that, but she would learn a little from him anyway. He later went on to make quite a few historical contributions. He's the one that corresponded with President Madison. He wrote treatises and legislation and things of that nature, died rather young. Charlotte Fortin Grimké is the daughter of the other brother, Henry. Sarah and Angelina's two favorite brothers, Henry and Thomas. She goes on to become a poet, a teacher. If you know anything about the islands off the coast of South Carolina, I know Conroy, the author, has written several books like that. With the Gullah language, is any of this ringing a bell? Have you heard of that? Okay, they're their own little culture. A lot of slaves escaped there when they were trying to escape the mainland. She goes out and becomes a famous teacher. Archibald Henry Grimké is discovered by Angelina and Sarah later in their life. Their brother Henry had had an affair, surprise, with a slave, happened a lot, and fathered two boys. And they were not abused, but certainly they weren't given a lot of privileges. When Angelina and Sarah found this out, they took both boys into their home, his brothers below here, educated them. He goes on to be one of the founders of the NAACP. You've heard of that? Okay, a Grimké. Became outstanding Negro leader between the death of Frederick Douglass and Booker T. Washington. You have Grimké in there. Again, I've heard of the others, but I never heard of him. This was a source in my Lerner book. This is the other brother, Francis James Grimké. He also, the Negro, His Rights and Wrongs, Reverend Grimké, again, starts out with his abolition talks from the pulpit. They all get a little bit more radicalized. But here you have some sites that you can go to for more information on all of those people. They're in the National Archives. You can find Library of Congress, definitely sites at South Carolina. Charlotte Fortin is the teacher earlier. Her journals are very, very famous for an exemplar of early journals documenting a black woman, and she was mixed race daughter of Henry. So it was very unique that she was given this voice. I guess in some schools, particularly in the South, they still study her and in younger grades as a nice example of journals. It's at this point that you do start to learn more about African American women, because previous to that, they were either illiterate or they did not have the resources to really put their story out other than verbal. And one other way I should mention here before we run out of time. I put some other characters that figure into the book. Theodore Dwight Weld, eventually Angelina Grimké, she's the looker of the two Grimkés. You saw their pictures at the beginning. All the historical evidence does say she was a very commanding figure. She had a powerful voice. She had striking eyes. They're always talking about her striking eyes. She was a handsome woman. That's the way they used to describe women back then. Sarah was the one behind the scenes, a lot of the thoughts, a lot of the writing, a lot of the ideas. And she radicalized Angelina. Angelina was 12 years younger, brought her into the Quaker fold briefly. They were both kicked out from the Quakers because they're women trying to go out and speak in public in front of people. And Theodore Weld, and I just added a link right before I came, John Greenleaf Whittier. You've heard of him, the poet? I'll bet Snowbound, you probably heard of a few of his poems. They were best friends who vowed never to marry until slavery was dead. Well, that worked for a while, but he and Angelina sort of had an intellectual, in fact, the letters are in some of the databases. Wasn't sexual at all, wasn't really courtship, but it was a melding of the minds, and oh, where could this go? So they married. And Sarah wasn't too keen on her sister marrying, but it was a deep, deep love match. John Whittier, he's like, okay, he went to the wedding. So Weld married Grimké. They were all friends with Harriet Beecher Stowe. You have the Mott in the book. Lucretia Mott plays a little more of a role than was, in fact, the case. Elizabeth Cady Stanton was a wealthy young bride when she was introduced to the Grimkes. They had no style, no pizzazz, definitely no money. What's up with these two? All the men admire them. She came around because after they had all these intellectual discussions among this group, all like-minded, all anti-slavery, and Elizabeth Cady Stanton, as you know, Susan B. Anthony, I had always thought of them as sort of mothers of women's rights and all. But no, even some of the sources about them give credit to the Grimkes for influencing them. And this is what really wowed me. I was like, how could I not know about these women? How could I not know? But you will find it if you look. And you don't have to look very far. As soon as you find two, they go around. Here's another famous individual, William Lloyd Garrison. These people were all a little group. The Liberator was an anti-slavery paper. This is where the Grimké sisters get their public entree into the minds and attentions of not just the media, but politicians, everybody. Angelina had written a letter to Garrison. And back then, correspondence was constant all the time. There was a flow of it. Thank goodness some people thought to preserve that, because that's the record of a lot of what we have. She wrote a letter to him expressing her sentiments on slavery, and he published it in his paper. He didn't ask her. He just published it. And she had some mixed thoughts about that, but it became huge. So who is this woman speaking like this? And that's what led to their speaking tours. The Grimké sisters got into so much hot water, kicked out of the Quaker, the Society of Friends, actually trying to find a spiritual home in a number of churches. They got in trouble not for their views, but because they were women daring to speak in public to mixed audiences. It was the whole mixed audiences that did it for a lot of men. Even Quakers and other men of the cloth who were very strong anti-slavery did not want a woman telling them what she thought, what they should think. And the end of it all was when they were writing their pieces on refuting what was being said from the pulpit and quoting the Bible. Point by point by point, they would take, because that was done a lot. Slavery, they would find a passage in the Bible, man is supposed to dominate over beast and this and that. They'd find examples of slavery in the Bible and talk and talk and talk about it. They went through point by point, very logical, using their brain, even without the formal education to think like an attorney, they were, and they refuted point by point by point all of these things that had been said for so long, everybody was starting to believe it. So this was when they started thinking, well, we could do and say a lot more. Our crowds are getting bigger, but we can't because we're mere women. You were the first folks to see and hear this, so if I'm looking around a little, it's because I've been moving stuff and I forget where I put it. I have a picture of Pennsylvania Hall in Philadelphia. It was a hall that was built, if I don't find it soon, nope. It was a hall that was built to house these anti-slavery meetings because they were getting bigger and bigger with nowhere to go. When Angelina was invited to speak to them, and it was quite a large crowd, she drew all kinds of people, including rebel-rousers who were already up to no good. Here's this woman. She's going to speak tonight. Let's go. You can see the firebrands and the crowds. They basically burnt the place down because here this woman is speaking. In some of the transcripts of her speech, there are little parenthetical bracketed remarks, and the crowd roars, and rocks were coming through the window, and there is literally an angry mob out there because the little spinster lady is standing up there telling them a thing or two about real Christian ideals. So it's just incredible to me that they even made it as far as they did. There were, this is where you start to see the split. It didn't start out as being strictly women's rights, but as I said, they're starting to say, well, wait a minute, we're talking human rights really, and that includes us too. So why can't we do both? And that's where they were kicked out of a lot of these organizations they had been on the periphery of, because they said, no, we can't split the movement. We've got to concentrate first on slaves and abolition. Later we'll work on women. Right now, concentrate on this. And this was a real point of contention. One of the reasons it took her so long to marry Thomas Weld, that was one of the reasons. They had this real dichotomy. No, stick with the movement. Then the Civil War came. Well, now we really have to fight for the slaves. They've been freed. We have to fight for their rights. Wait, we'll get to you later. So it isn't until, as we know, the 20th century that women are really sick and tired of it, and they're starting to mobilize and say, well, now it's our time, because they were delayed for 60-some years from the beginning of this. But you do see the formation of female anti-slavery societies. And this is part of the difficulty of coalescing the early women's movement. In the beginning, in the 19th century is where you start to see growing middle class, mostly in urban areas. You start to see more nationalism, but you see regionalism. People are still, there's the South, Civil War and all of that. People are really starting to feel statehood in their regions, but they're also starting to feel like we're talking women, but what women are we? Because there've always been working women, but there were lots of domestics, lots of women occupied so that they couldn't go to a meeting, they couldn't read, they couldn't do a lot. So this was largely, these anti-slavery societies, the female ones, were mostly middle class, some upper class, largely suburbs and urban areas. There weren't too many suburbs yet. But it was extremely rare for these two genteel women from money and background from the South to come and talk to people about it, and that was part of their notoriety. Let's see, what else here? Oh, okay, the quilts. You're wondering why I have these things out front here. I have a little underground here. In the book, back to the book again, Hetty Handful and her mother are seamstresses, and as household slaves, very often, if they found out you had a skill like that, you were any good at it, they really fostered that. Everything was handmade. All of their to-do, whether it's for the racetrack, the spring season, tea parties, wedding, funeral, they had to make new clothes. They were done by hand. So Hetty and her mother were seamstresses. Even the little gloves like this, there's some description of them making the little gloves. For their own pleasure may not be quite the right word I'm looking for, but there is a history of quilting from African textile arts. And there's controversy about this too. I had no idea. I just assumed everybody knew about the Underground Railroad and the quilts. Have you ever seen one of those presentations? There's someone in northern Illinois that goes to the libraries every now and then. I'd like to go to one. Supposedly, with the Underground Railroad, there's certain patch squares that were symbols, and they would hang a quilt out, and it would say, the man who lives here is friendly to runaway slaves, or there's a vicious dog, watch out when you come, or you can get food here, or the Underground Railroad station next is, the bear claw pattern means you have to go through the woods. I mean, supposedly there's a whole story behind this. Then there's a whole faction that says, no, people are reading it into it. That didn't exist. I choose to believe. I've read too much about it, seen too much, and I thought this would make perfect sense. Just like the visual arts have always made sense for people who don't have facility with language or the ability to read and write. What do? They look at stained glass windows in a church to tell the story. What do? They make quilts to tell their story. Hetty Handful created quilts And why do I have dinner napkins, you say? Well, I was pulling out laundry 2 nights ago. My husband said, what are you doing? And I said, well, if I fold the napkins now, then it keeps them all neat. And I said, wait a minute. This looks like the triangles that Hetty Handful would do. She had triangles on a red background and gold. I guess these were colors of fabric that they found quickly and easily, but it was also a theme from African textiles. They used triangles in their quilt to represent blackbirds and wings. And the title of the book, The Invention of Wings, is alluding to that. Both Hetty Handful and her mother, who are hoping to get wings to escape their circumstances someday. And you have wings in, where's my feather? They would go around the yard, the poultry farm. I was looking for more feathers, but they were hot pink and yellow. They weren't working. They would be working around in the yard, and they would pick up feathers. They would cut their hair and stuff their quilts with all of these things. They also did it, though, to be meaningful. They would put artifacts in little pouches, acorns, pieces of leaves for their spirit tree. So there's a very spiritual side. A lot of it is connected with textiles. I had the cup here. Hetty Handful and her mother were very fortunate. In their room, they might have a candle, they might have a cup. Most slaves did not. I was reading Frederick Douglass's eyewitness accounts of slave children on a plantation, and there'd be a long trough exactly like they used for the pigs, and they would throw some slop in there. It was barely more than gruel. They'd call the children would come in literally on their hands and knees eating out of the trough because they had no utensils, no cups. The lucky ones might have a scoop or a shell. I'm telling you, when you read a lot of these stories, it's really quite compelling. I had no idea until I started looking at the historical record on some of this, but it backs up a lot of the fictionalized version of things she was saying, and that was really my aim. I like to see how much of it is fiction and historical fiction and how much is fact. And a lot of people say, I don't want to read an encyclopedia or a history book or whatever. This is where I always promote historical fiction. I love it because there's quite a bit there. Most of it, really, depends on the author, that's grounded in fact, but you're getting the juicy bits. What really happened when they went to bed at night? What really happened when they talked amongst each other? So you get the author's creativity in that, but I find a lot in there that's truthful. You had your teacup over here for the ladies and their fans. And on the other side, you had, now this is in fine shape, it would be rusted, dented. When they went to do their labors at day, the slaves would be dispensed. They would line up in the yard. They would be dispensed their bar of soap for washing cloth. They would be dispensed the scuttle to do coal. Whatever tool they needed, it was given to them for the day. So it's two very different worlds. And you have the one genteel lady on the one side who's trying to reject this out of a true sense of Christian conscience. And really all along it's based in Christianity. But along the way, they rather discover, wait a minute, how can we call ourselves Christians? How can we do our prayers? How can we go to church on Sundays and make our slaves sing those songs and read to our slaves and quote the Bible to them all the time, but we don't treat them that way. We don't treat them like Christians. Aren't they beings like us? So I hope you get a chance to explore the guide. I have a lot of quotes from the sisters. I didn't go into their historical documents, but if you read some of the things they actually spoke aloud to mixed audiences, it'd be, right now it doesn't seem terribly radical, but if you put them in context of their time, it was extremely radical. And you saw their picture on the first page. They just don't look like radicals, but radicals they were. So I hope you get a chance to explore the Grimké's, little bit of slave quilts. If you ever make it up to our library, I can point you to tons. We literally have tons of material on these topics. So if you're ever interested in that, I encourage you to come and see me. You'll have to beat me off with a stick. I won't leave you alone. Has anybody read it yet? Yes, you did, because she brought it back in time so I could have it. I said, Jonna, I need to put my Post-it notes in there. I have it on my tablet, but I'm still a Post-it note kind of person, so I had to have that in there. Well, there's a lot I didn't get to share, but I don't want to give, I actually completely revamped what I was going to do today because it occurred to me, I don't want to spoil the book. So then I thought I would talk more about the historical part and less about the actual book. But really, I have read her books. I really liked Secret Life of Bees. This one really struck a chord with me. And again, I never heard of them. So now, if I ever go down that way, for sure I'm going to have to look up the Grimké sisters. So that's about all I have to say on the Grimké sisters, unless you get the hook out. Take me away. All right, thanks.